Great segue, because I am speaking quite a bit here out of the Old Testament and biblical history. I wasn't there. I didn't live through it. But yeah, I've had the good fortune of, I got onto this devotional app this year that you read through the Bible in a year, but it does it chronologically. And so I really enjoyed that, because you'll be reading in one spot and it'll reference to another spot right away. And it's a concurrent time that's actually happening. And so a lot of the things I was reading came to mind. And when I knew that I was going to be speaking, I thought, why don't I share some of the things that I've been learning, and how some of the Old Testament history speaks into that. So we're going to do that tonight. And we're going to be talking about lordship and about leadership and about intimacy. But before we get into things, let's take a minute and pray. Okay. Father, we're grateful that your word is truth, and Lord, that you will find a purpose as your word goes forward tonight. So I pray that I would get out of the way and let you do your thing. And God, that you would seed your word in the hearts of these people tonight and let it grow and flourish and just create a bountiful harvest, Lord, well up into fruit that has just a great impact to the world around them. Lord, thanks for this time and for the things you want to say to us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, well, we're going to give this backdrop here to you first. And I want to lay this foundation a little bit, because what we're talking about here is kind of the onset of the kingdoms of Israel and the kings, the leaders that we see in Israel. And if you go back to the time when the Israelites were in Egypt, they were really stranded there. They were under the thumb of the Pharaoh. And we know that Moses eventually got them out of that, and they were led out of Egypt. He leads them, in the book of Exodus. Moses takes the Israelites. They leave, and Pharaoh is standing there stranded. And all that process of Israel departing Egypt was absolutely miraculous. And if you think about it, in that time, there was the parting of the Red Sea. First of all, he had to get the Israelites, Pharaoh had to agree to let them go. So finally he agrees to let them go, and they go off, and the Israelites march across the Red Sea. It was dry land. The sea folds in on the Egyptians, and they move forward in the land. God sets up a pillar of fire for them to follow by night, so they know where they're headed. Same thing in the daytime. There's a cloud that they follow. God provides food in terms of manna. He gives them water. He does all these great things. The quail are there. But Israelite, the nation of Israel really becomes hardened towards all that God does for them. And, throughout this time, it's about a period of about 460 years that we see Israel come out of Egypt to the time we're going to talk about now, where the kings start to come into play. And the interesting thing here is that through all those miracles and all the things that the Israelites got to see God do, all the victories that they had won in conquering other peoples, they had strayed, and they didn't really have hearts that were really after God. In fact, they had chosen to chase other gods, and they no longer lived in God's presence. So even in spite of all those things that happened, they decided that they didn't want God as their king anymore. They wanted a real, live, flesh and blood king. Somebody that wasn't the king of kings, but was one like them, like the other countries had. And they're in dire straits. They're in a tough spot, the nation of Israel. When they marched across the Red Sea and into the Promised Land, they took with them the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was really a symbol of what God's presence was to them. The commandments were there, and it was God's dwelling with the people. And yet, here they find themselves in the situation where the Philistines have come in and they've taken the Ark. They don't even have the Ark of God anymore. So they are abandoned. They feel like they're just in dire straits. And they've had enough, and they want their own king. They want to do their own thing. But fortunately for the Israelites, there's one guy who stands up and has a few things to say for God in this time. And we're going to talk about 3 different people tonight that are really influential in the book of 1 Samuel. And that's where we're going to do most of our reading tonight. And this guy, his name is Samuel. Enter Samuel. Anybody know who Samuel was? Well, Samuel was a prophet. He was a man of God. And Samuel was apprenticed to Eli, who was one of God's priests. And what happens is Samuel hears God's voice at an early age, and for his entire life, Samuel walks close to God. And Samuel ends up becoming enamored by the Israelites, but they still don't really want God's leadership. But they let Samuel lead them because he's God's man. And Samuel leads them to some victories. In fact, he goes out and they end up getting the Ark of the Covenant back. And they have some success there. But when Samuel is finally getting up in years and they've got this ark back, the Israelites say, you know what, Samuel, we want a real king. We want somebody who's flesh and blood. And Samuel's devastated. His heart's after God, but his people, their heart's not there. And so God's calling for every part of the Israelites to be his, all the time, and they don't want to have anything to do with him. And that really grieves Samuel. So the first thing I want to highlight here is the contrast between God's people and God's man, and that's Samuel. Samuel has a heart that is really in tune and on fire for God, and yet the people that he leads are not there. He has an unwavering lordship about his life, and it makes all the difference to the nation of Israel, as we're going to see. That unwavering lordship. If you think about that, here's Israel that doesn't want anything to do with God anymore, and they cry out and they cry out and they cry out, and God finally decides, okay, you asked for a king, I'm going to give you a king. So let's look at what happens here in 1 Samuel 8, verses 1 through 9, okay? Will's going to bring it up here. You've got some background now. It says this: when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people that are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." Okay? So he lays out for them all the things that are going to happen here. He says, you know what, this king that you want, you may think he's going to be a great thing for you, but he's going to lord it over you. He's going to take your possessions. He's going to tax you. He's going to put you in difficult positions. You're going to have to make weapons of war. You're going to have to pull in the harvest for him, and you're going to be his subject. And it's not going to be all that you think it is. But they still don't relent. And then if you look on in verses 19 through 21, he says this. He goes back and tells the people all those things. But in 19, it says, "But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, all the other nations with a king to lead us and to go out before us and to fight our battles." Wow, how quickly they forget. God had gone out and fought all these battles for Israel before, all to their benefit, and yet they've now turned their back on their God, and they want flesh and blood to be their leader. And you know, isn't that just like God? That's okay. Well, you can take it down now. Isn't that just like God? You know, sometimes God gives us what we really want because he wants to teach us what we really need. That's a hard lesson sometimes. To get what you really want when God has something better that you really need. You know, I think about the story in the New Testament about the prodigal son who knew what he wanted. Okay, he wanted he wanted his father's inheritance. He wanted his inheritance early. So, you know, he goes to his dad and he says, "Dad, you're as good as dead to me." You guys know this story probably. But I want take my stuff and run. And he gets his inheritance and he runs off and he spends it on hookers and booze. And he's a mess. And he soon realizes that, you know what? Here I am with the pigs and I've had it better at home. I wonder if my dad would take me back as a hired hand. Even there I can eat at least as well as the pigs. So he goes back home, and his dad's there waiting with welcome arms. You see, he thought he knew what he wanted, but his dad really knew what he needed. He needed a relationship. And so often we're looking for what we want in things, but God has his best for us in relationship with him. Okay. So I know that personally because I had a daughter who lived through that. My wife and I had a daughter who lived that story. And it was wonderful to see her return and realize that, yeah, you know what? I'm much better trusting God and living for him than chasing the wind, because it didn't work out so well. God is gracious in not giving us what we really deserve. Sometimes he gives us what we want, but sometimes, usually he doesn't give us what we really deserve, because if he gave us what we deserve, we'd be doomed to destruction. So, what kind of king are you choosing tonight? What is it that you're desiring that maybe is usurping God's rightful place in your life? Something to ponder. Is it more talent? Is it more brains or playing time? Is it a boyfriend or girlfriend? Maybe, tonight for you guys, I know how you're feeling. Maybe it's just the fact that you just want a season. You want to be able to compete, to have a start date for your first date of competition and get out there and go. But God's in the middle of all that for you. And he wants you to trust him in that. He wants you to realize, relate to him and trust him for what you really need. Okay. Well, here we have the Israelites, and they wanted the favor of God, but not his presence. They wanted the gifts that he had for them, the winds and whatever else, but they didn't want the giver. They didn't want him himself. But God's patient. He waits out for them, and he knows that there'll be a time when he can give it. The Israelites will come to their senses, hopefully, and he can give them himself. So he says in verse 21, listen to them and give them a king. So that's what he does. He gives them a king. Enter Saul. Saul is the second person we're going to talk about tonight. God tells Samuel, here's his prophet. He says, I know this guy that they want. They want this king, so I'm going to select a king for them. And I'm going to give you this list of circumstances. And if you follow these situations and this circumstance and go to this place, you're going to run into this man that they want. And he's the new king. I'll identify him to you. So Saul goes out and he goes through the jumps through the hoops and goes through the machinations of what God calls him to do to find this new king. And he comes across this guy, and he's impressed. Here's a guy that's here, and he's tall. Scriptures say that Saul is an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites. He's a head taller than any of the others. This guy is tall, he's dark, he's handsome. You know what? He's just what the people ordered. You have this guy who's, a charismatic leader, this guy that you think is going to step in and be this satisfactory guy to take God's place, essentially, as a leader. And so God confirms it. God says, yeah, Samuel, you're right. That's him. That's the guy. And so Saul anoints him as king. Now, the only people that know that he's been anointed as king are Samuel and Saul. The people don't know yet because they aren't back in town. So what happens is God says, you know what? He's not going to do this job on his own, so I'm going to give him my spirit. And God's spirit comes on him. He's powerful in what he says and what he does, and he's completely changed into a different person, okay? The power of God does that to us, doesn't it? And it happens right away. So then Samuel gathers the people, and he says, you know what? You wanted a king. And Samuel's thinking to himself, I know who the king is. And Saul knows who's the king is. But the people don't know yet. So I'm going to do this. We're going to draw lots, and we're going to find out who the king is. So he brings them together by tribe, and he draws that up from the tribe, and it's the tribe of Benjamin. And now they go to the clans, and they draw from the clans, and it's a certain clan, certain family. And then he goes from there, and he draws this name, and it's the name of Saul. Astounding, right? Took a lot of faith for Samuel to put himself out there like that and actually have it end up being Saul. But he knew that God had confirmed it, so he trusted it. And now the people are thrilled, and they go, well, where's this king? Where's this king? And they look for him, but they can't find him. And you know why they can't find him? Because Saul wasn't a guy of character. In fact, he's terrified. He's hiding in the baggage compartment. And they have to go out and find him. And they get him from the baggage, and they come out and they say, oh, wow, he is. He's tall, dark, and handsome. He's everything you dreamed he would be. And now he's our king. You see, the first hint we see of Saul being compromised as a flesh and blood king is that he's fearful if he relies on his own strength. Saul wasn't equipped for the job that he was called to do, not by his own attributes. He's going to have to rely completely on God, walk in the Spirit to lead, or he's going to fail. So Samuel then says farewell, but before he does this. He says, you know what? I'm going to leave you. I won't be far. I'll be around, but I want to leave a final message with you. And he rakes them over the coals because of what they've done. So 1 Samuel 1, 12 through 1 Samuel 12, 7 through 24 says this. Will's going to bring that up and we're going to read through it. It's a little bit of a long passage, but it's going to give you the real message, and it shows you the heart of Samuel as a leader. Okay. So in verse 7, he says this, Now then stand here, because I'm going to confront you with the evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord and for you and your ancestors. After Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God. So he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, we've sinned. We've forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. But deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samuel, and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you, so that you lived in safety. But then you saw King Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you. And you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us. And even though the Lord your God was your king, now here's the king you've chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him, and do not rebel against his commands, and if you both, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your ancestors. He said, you asked for this, and now you're going to get it. You wanted a king, and now you're going to get the king that you asked for. But you know what? You're not going to get me in this. Not necessarily. He says, I'm going to lead this king, but it's going to be a challenge if you walk apart from me. And he says, now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. He says, isn't now the time to harvest the wheat? Yeah, they have a big crop out in the field, okay? And he does this. He says, I'll call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you'll realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. He says, you've got all these crops out there that you're ready to harvest, but I'm going to show you what God can do, and we're going to destroy those crops. And he calls on God, and that same day, in verse 18, it says, God sent thunder and rain. So all the people then stood in awe of the Lord and Samuel, and they all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God, your servants, so that we will not die. For we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. They see now what God meant to them, okay? God didn't give them what they deserved, but they're now seeing what they should have really asked for. Samuel says this. He says, you know what? Don't be afraid. You've done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against God by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Okay. What an excoriation to the Israelites. But even in all of that, God still gives them hope that, you know what? You walk with me and you'll be in my favor. I'll lead your king. He can follow me. Don't step out of line, because then you're going to be in disarray. So he exhorts them to this unwavering lordship. That's what he wants them to have. unwavering lordship. But you know, you can Saul can find success, but the only way he's going to do that is if he has this connection with God. I mean, how do you have unwavering lordship if you don't walk close to God? You can't lead unless you do that. And so we see that unwavering lordship is a catalyst for this inspiring leadership that the Israeli people have been calling for. And Saul knows he can't do it on his own, so he has to trust God to be that inspiring leader that he needs to be. You know, I've had the good fortune of having some good teams in my era. And we had 3 national championship teams that were really kind of amazing. And the reason I say they were amazing wasn't because they were the most talented teams in the field. In fact, they weren't. But what made them championship teams was they had great leadership amongst the members of that team. In fact, the captains of those teams were top drawer. And they made all the difference in leading those teams, inspiring those teams to buy into what we were saying as coaches, but also to believe who they could be, what we were saying they could be. And great character will be great talent 7 days a week. And you guys experience that. You know that. You see that. You live that every day. Some of you are great talents. Some of you aren't. But you know this, that talent only goes so far, but character goes all the way. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about character that will create an inspiring leader. So Saul goes out in his first duty that's before him, and he goes out and he routs the Ammonites. Now, Saul has the benefit of 330,000 troops in his hands. So it wasn't that much of a challenge, but nonetheless, he comes back victorious, and the people are shouting his praises, and they love what they've seen, okay? They're back in the saddle, and they're getting it done. And he goes out on the next outing, but they have victory, but it's tainted, and it's tainted in this way. God told them, when you go out and you go into this group, I want you to rout them. In fact, you're to leave no king. In fact, you're not to take any plunder. You're to destroy all the possessions and bring nothing back with you, because that's my command. And I kind of detest what I see there. And so Saul goes out and they do that. They go out and they win. But he doesn't kill the king. And in fact, they take the best of the possessions, all the best cattle and the livestock, and they plunder the town and they keep it for themselves. Now, Saul has failed in his second act as a king. He's gone in direct disobedience to God. He's acted unfavorably towards what God called him to do. You know, obedience is such a measure of our lordship. And God says in John, he says, he who has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and show myself to him. You know, the more we obey God, the more we honor him and show our love for him. But here's Saul. He doesn't really have the connection that Samuel's had with God. And he falls and he fails. And you know what God does? God removes his presence and his anointing from Saul, and he removes him as king. Now, he's still in place as the king and will be for maybe 40 more years, but God's favor is no longer on Saul. And I don't know if you've ever walked in that place where you felt distant from God because of your disobedience, but we are, as believers, are really rendered ineffective, okay? It messes with our prayer life. It messes with our relationships. We've created distance between God that's tough to bridge until we get right with God, until we snuggle up close, okay? Until we make him back on the throne of our life and confess the things that we've messed up with. And that's kind of where Saul is. He's kind of committed to doing his own thing because, you know what? He's been king now. He's tasted the glory that he's been given by his people, and he's kind of liked it, and he likes being in that spot. Great leaders lead by tried and true principles. They lead because of their dedication to those principles, because of their work ethic, their service, their sacrifice, their consistency, maybe their innovation, their ability to think out of the box. And certainly they lead and win because of their humility. People want to follow somebody who's willing to go there first. And Saul chose to lead with compromise to God's principles, and he pays this big price. You know, I don't know what kind of leaders you've been around, But it's interesting to note that sometimes we don't notice the significance of leadership until it's gone, until it's not there, till it's absent. Okay. Um, Let me give you an example of this. It's been said that the most powerful word in the English language, from a societal standpoint, is dad. Three simple letters, D-A-D. You know, that's pretty, how can you say that? If you doubt this, think about this. Think about all the societal issues that occur due to a lack of a loving and responsible father figure in the home. Crime, delinquency, respect, sexual objectification of women, sexual assault, work ethic, a ton of issues that we see today. All can simply stem from the lack of a strong male presence. Now, I'm not saying that to be sexist. I could say mom here just as well, okay? But statistics show that without a dad in play, that there's a significant loss to what people can become. Fortunately, God can make that up, okay? And that's hope for all of us. Some of you probably had homes that didn't have a dad, and you've turned out terrifically, which is awesome. But the absence of that leadership is profound. So, the Bible says this. It says when leadership is absent, the people lack clear vision. It says that without vision, the people will perish. It's kind of like you without a season, okay? How hard has it been to train and really prepare as a group, as a team, as a family, when you don't have a season before you? Has it been different? Okay, probably has. I know it has as a coach. It's been a little bit more challenging. It's certainly been different from my guys, knowing, are we going to have a season? Are we not going to have a season? When's the first meet? You put that mark on the calendar, and that's your first competition. You've got really something to shoot at. Okay, you take that away, and you have no endpoint. It's a much more difficult position. But fortunately for Saul, so fortunately for the Israelites, God's favor stands with Samuel still. And he says, Samuel, I want you to go out and I want you to anoint a new king. A new king. Okay, they're still going to get their flesh and blood king, but you're going to get a new one. So in 1 Samuel 16, verses 6 and 7, we have another passage here we're going to read, and we're going to talk about that real quick. Okay. Okay, it says this. This is when he picks the new king. Samuel goes through the same machinations. God tells him, I want you to go to this certain place, certain time. You're going to come across this family. You're going to see these people, and then you're going to choose the king from those people. Okay. In verse 6, it says, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, wow, surely this anointed stands before the Lord. God says, you know what? No. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. They fell into that mistake before with Saul, this tall, dark, and handsome guy. And here's Samuel. He's the Lord's anointed, right? He just figures, oh, it's got to be him because he looks the part. He fell right into the same mistake. But God goes, no, 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 no. I'm looking at what's inside, not on the outside. God wants us to consider the heart before the height. Character, yeah, I just said it beats talent. So you think about that in all your relationships, whether it's, a dating relationship or hiring or whatever it might be, that heart issue is really important. That heart component is the most important. I think about this story that I heard, and you may have heard this before, but there was a homeless guy kind of wandering around outside the church one day. And it's kind of an exciting Sunday. People are excited to come in and worship. And the homeless man walks in, and he's obviously unkempt and hasn't showered. He hasn't shaved, doesn't smell so good. And the people in the congregation are kind of ignoring him because, he just seems to be a little bit out of place. And so no one really goes over and makes a move to make him feel welcome or at home. And the worship starts, and people sing, and they're worshiping God, and they're starting to forget about the homeless man who's there. And they realize that, okay, we're going to get into the sermon now. And the lead elder of the church gets up and introduces the speaker for that day. And he says, I'm excited to introduce to you today our new pastor. And he says the pastor's name, and the homeless man goes forward and takes the pulpit. And the people are shocked because his outward appearance didn't seem anything like the person that they expected. They expected to have some sharp-looking guy in a suit and tie who comes up with the biggest, blackest, thickest Bible you've ever seen, and he's going to preach the word. But no, this pastor comes up and says, you know what? Jesus said, if you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. And he puts them in their place lovingly. But nonetheless, he says, you know what? God doesn't look at the outward appearance. He looks at the heart. And we need to be the kind of people that do that too. And so that's a good lesson for us, just as it was the Israelites and for Samuel. You know, God's the one who raises up leaders. And sometimes that's a hard thing for us to swallow. We are in the midst of in 30 more days or so here, we're going to have a presidential election. And we'll decide Senate seats and our government. And there's a lot of angst right now in our country. Whether you're on the right or the left or wherever you're at, it's very partisan right now. And people want their guy or their person. But whatever happens, when the time comes, God's the one who's going to be in charge. And Daniel realized this years ago. He said, God changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. Okay? So it's God who puts the people who are over us in authority in that authority. Now, that might not be a very comforting thing to know when you have a difficult time with your parents, or you have a difficult time with your coach, or you have a difficult time eventually with a boss, or you have someone else in authority in your life. That's a difficult pill to swallow when you're facing difficult stuff and injustice, as we're going to talk about a little bit later here. But God's the one who's in charge. So back to the selection of the next king. And Samuel goes through each brother. He went to Eliab, and he wasn't the guy. And he goes to the next brother, and the next brother, and the next brother. And finally, there's no brothers left there. And he says, well, isn't there anybody else? Because God hasn't told me that that's the guy. And he said, well, we have one more brother, but he's not here. He's out leading the sheep. He's a shepherd. And he says, well, we'll go get him. And he brings him in, and God says, yes, he's the one. The shepherd boy is the one who's going to lead Israel as king. And he'll be the forerunner of Jesus, the coming king. And that shepherd boy's name was David. David. You know David as the one who faced Goliath, right? We're going to get into that in just a second here. But David is a shepherd boy. And what's he know? Well, he knows he's spent a lot of time outdoors by himself with the sheep. And while he's out there, he learns to play all kinds of instruments. He's a skilled musician. He's a skilled hunter. He knows the land. But more than that, he spent a lot of time not alone, but in the quiet. And in that quiet, he cultivated a relationship with the one who created all the land around him. And he knows God. He knows his heart. He knows his voice. He knows his footsteps. He knows his presence. And David is zealous for God. God's passions are David's passions. The things that break God's heart are the things that break David's heart. David has been said that he's a man after God's own heart. Well, Samuel realizes that this is the chosen one. And he, like Saul, he then anoints him as the next king. Now, Saul continues to reign and serve in that position. But we know that Samuel knows that he's going to be the king. And David knows he's going to be the king. Okay? So with that in mind, God's spirit left Saul. God allows an evil spirit to come on Saul. And it's a tough thing for him to handle. I mean, he's in anguish. He's got this mental situation that he's dealing with. And he knows this kid that's pretty good with the harp and the lyre, and he can sing songs. And so he calls this kid in and says, man, put me to sleep. Soothe me with this. And so David comes into Saul's presence, and he's there to help him. Okay? He soothes him, and he makes his life better. But it's not long before Saul has to go out and conquer some more. Okay? Even though he doesn't have God's presence with him, he's got to go out and lead the people. So he finds himself on the side of a mountain, and there's another tribe on the other side, and it's the Philistines. And in the middle is a valley. And who's there but Goliath in the middle of the valley? And every day Goliath comes out and taunts the Israelites and says, send your guy down and let's do battle, and whoever wins, gets the spoils. And David comes by, and you know the story. He's had enough. You're not standing up for Israel? this happens every day and you let this happen? He goes, I'll go take this guy on. I don't care if I'm just just but a boy, you know, probably a late teenager or early 20s. He says, I'll take him on and I'll do it because you know what? God doesn't win by swords and spears. God saves because he saves. And this battle is God's. And today God's going to give you into all of our hands. So he defeats the Goliath. He goes out and he defeats him. And he defies all the odds. And David isn't the king, but his courageous defeat of Goliath inspired an entire nation. He was willing to stand up in that gap when there was a void of leadership from Saul, the leader who was supposed to go down and lead his people to victory here, but no one would take it because they were terrified. But because he stood in the gap when no one else would, the people are so taken with Saul, with Daniel now, with David. They're so taken with David. And they realize this guy's got it going on. And they have this song that they sing, the people. They sing, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. You know, leadership is kind of like Star Trek. It goes where no man has gone before. If you're going to be an inspiring leader, you better be willing to go there. You better be willing to go where no one else is willing to go. David was that guy. He was the one who was taking it on. I do this with my team all the time. I talk to him about, I need that guy that's ready to go in the back alley with me. Or the guy that says, you know what? Give me the ball. I'm ready to go. Last man up. You need a 15-2 on high bar. I'm your guy. Put me in. I'll go out and get the score. I'm ready. Those are the kind of warriors I want on my team. God wants those kind of warriors on his bench as well. Those people who are willing to stand in the gap when it's tough. So let me ask you just real quick. Who are your inspiring leaders? Think about that for a second. Who inspires you in your day and age? Or what about in your church life or your life in general? What qualities do they have? I mean, I think of people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood up against Nazi Germany for his faith. Okay, I think about Nelson Mandela. I think about people like Martin Luther King. You know, people who went where people weren't necessarily willing to go, and yet they did a great justice for everybody in taking on what hadn't been taken on before. You know, Hebrews 11, there's a huge list of people that are honored because of their faith. It's called the Hall of Fame of Faith. And everybody listed in that chapter had extraordinary faith, but that faith was evidenced by their actions, by the things that they did. You know, we're pretty common, most of us. But just because we're common doesn't mean we can't exercise extraordinary faith and make extraordinary contributions to God. God uses the ordinary to the extraordinary. And he's calling us to do that too. So David's actions flowed out of his allegiance to God. And David's allegiance flowed from his intimacy with God. You see, unwavering lordship and inspiring leadership can only come out of intimate fellowship. It's that intimate fellowship that we need to have to be able to be what God calls us to be. We can't do it if we walk apart from God, as we see with Saul. Can't do it. So let's look at David's life as an example. We're gonna wrap it up here pretty quickly. We're getting shorter on time. You know, David took some great actions as a leader, and we could know. We look back at some of the victories that he had, and also he had fallen a few times as well, and those were spectacular failures that he had as well. But one of the things when I was reading through this devotional that struck me, and I began to compare some of the scriptures, was not the action he took, but in fact, the lack of action that he took that spoke to me the most. And let me give you an example of that. It really spoke to his intimate relationship with God. You see, you know, when Saul heard that this song that was sung, that Saul had slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, Saul was slighted, okay? He was the real king. He was the one who was in place, right? No one knew yet that David was king. And Saul began to be really jealous. So the rest of his days, Saul despises David. In fact, so great is his jealousy that he decides, you know what? I'm going to take him out. This guy's going to die. And David runs away. He's terrified. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's just been who God wants him to be. And because of that, he's persecuted and he's chased. And all of the Psalms that you see, many of those Psalms were written during that time, 7-year period or so, where David's out in the wilderness and he's crying out to God because he's being chased all over the place by Saul. David knows he's been anointed the next king, but far be it from him to do anything to Saul, because Saul is the one that God has appointed as king. He's going to honor that. He's going to honor that position that's been put there. So there's a couple situations that come up. David's hiding out in a cave, and he's in the middle of the wilderness, and he's fleeing from Saul, and Saul has been chasing him. He comes into the cave, and quite honestly, he goes in, and the scriptures tell us, he goes in to relieve himself. And while he's there, David says, well, this is my opportunity, not to kill Saul, but to show him that I'm not against him. And so he goes up and he cuts off a little corner of his robe. And Saul departs finally, finishes his business. Saul departs and he's leaving. And when he's walking across the field there, David emerges from the cave and he says, Saul, he cries out to him. And Saul turns around and he shows him, he said, you meant harm for me. I'm not meaning any harm for you. I could have easily killed you. And he shows him the corner of the robe that he had cut off. And Saul is devastated. He goes, you're right. You're right. You're a better man than I. And he walks away and he realizes that he's done the wrong thing. But you know what? His jealousy keeps getting the best of him. And over time, it wells up again and again and again. And he hears about the, situation that David's in, and he just can't have enough of it. He's got to take him out. So another time he's out with his army, and David sneaks into his camp at night, and he goes over next to Saul and he steals his spear. Okay. And also he takes his water jug. And in the morning, Saul wakes up and he looks around and he goes, where's my spear and my water jug? And David crawls out from the hillside and he says, Saul, once again, I could have easily killed you, but I've got your spear and your water jug. Why are you persecuting? Why are you coming after me? I'm honoring God by honoring your position. Please don't do this to me. Saul again says, okay, whatever. You're right. You're a better man than I. Why would you lay a hand on God's anointed? I can't do it, says David, but you're willing to do that to me. David's responses in the face of his injustice, he could have easily taken action and been violent. But what did David choose? David chose to act differently. He chose not to act. He chose to turn the other cheek and to forgive, rather than killing the guy that has made his life a living hell for 7+ years. So you think about that in terms of where we're at today. What have we been witnessing on TV? There's all kinds of things happening. Sure, there's all kinds of injustice, but there's also all kinds of responses that we can take to that. And there's a time and season and a place for everything. The scriptures say that. But how do you deal with injustice? I mean, what was it like to end up not getting the playing time that you deserved, or to get the scholarship that was promised to you and you didn't get that and had to go, deal with something else? Or, we all have injustices in our life. David was able to respond to that situation with God because he had spent so much time with God that he knew what the character of God was. God oozes all kinds of qualities and characteristics. And when we're up close, that rubs off on us. It's the barometer. Our intimacy with God is like a barometer of how we're going to respond in the face of injustice. Okay. Jesus fully took this on. Philippians 2:3 says this. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Okay. But with humility of mind, consider others as more important than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be like that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. See, Jesus is God. And even though he was scorned and crucified, set up on that cross, he could have taken action, but he didn't. He didn't just turn the other cheek, he forgave. And God raised him to the highest place. Okay. When faced with injustice, David and Jesus didn't respond in a way that declared their entitlement. They responded with humility because that's what they saw oozing from God as they walked with him daily. We need to be that close to God so that when we come up with hardship and injustice in other situations, that we ooze out the character that we see from God. That comes because you walk intimately with God. All of those individuals listed in the Hall of Fame of Faith were ordinary people. They demonstrated extraordinary faith. And they could do that because they had extraordinary intimacy with God. So maybe you won't be called to be some big dynamic leader. Okay. You won't lead the masses. But you know what? You might be called to be a dad or a mom or a friend or a teammate or an employee. And your words and your example are going to make a difference. The choice you have to make is, will you do it as a dynamic and inspiring leader because you've been with God? And will you do it as somebody who has unwavering lordship? Because without unwavering lordship, you won't experience that intimacy. They all go hand in hand. David and Samuel and Saul all showed us the do's and don'ts of lordship and leadership and intimacy. Now we can walk from there, step out tomorrow, and choose how we're going to do that. Okay? So you got about 5 minutes left, and you got 4 questions. So I think we should take a couple minutes, and Will, can you get us into those groups and look at those 4 questions? And maybe you can spend, a minute or 2 on each of them, and then we'll come back and finish up. Okay?
So I'm going to put the questions up on the screen so that we can see them.
Yep.
If you have your phone, take a picture of it so you have them in a group. That way it'll be easy to remember, because I don't know if I can get them to you.
Yeah, somebody take charge and keep track of time a little bit. Just give like 1 or 2 minutes per question and move on. Okay? can't get too far from God. And the beautiful thing is you can't get too close to God. God always calls you closer. So keep walking towards God, and you're going to get there. And if you have a setback, his forgiveness is there. His mercy is new the next morning. Get back in and continue to pursue God. And hopefully that turns into an unwavering lordship, and your intimacy is strong, and he'll make you the kind of leader that he can really use.
Okay. Any last thoughts? Anybody need to share? Sam is going to share some things with us after she hand claps.